Today's daf we're going to be learning is Zevachim daf Yud Bet, a much simpler daf than yesterday. Today's daf is sponsored by Jason, Erica, and Raquel in honor of Patty Belkin on her birthday, a dedicated daf learner. And today's daf is sponsored by Lisa Kalani in honor of a fellow daf learner, Nancy Kalani. Welcome to Israel. So glad you and Jerry are moving here. Mazal tov on your aliyah. Okay, we're going to get started with where we ended in yesterday's daf. So we started with this Mishnah. It had two parts to it. Today we're going to conquer both parts. The first is this unique opinion of Ben Beteira, or this machloket, really, between Ben Beteira and Rabbi Oshaya. I don't know which is more unique, but what the status of doing a Pesach Shalol Lishma. Remember, let's just review all our rules. A Pesach that's done with the intent for the wrong korban. Okay, let's just review some basic rules that will come up later today also. If it's any other day of the year, we basically sacrifice it as a shlamim. Okay, a Pesach Shalol Lishma is not disqualified. Okay, that's the first part. It's not disqualified. But a Pesach on the day when Pesach sacrifice is supposed to be sacrificed is disqualified if we do it l'shem, a different korban. We have the wrong intent. Again, if you haven't had a chance yet to listen to the extra content relating in general to lishma and the whole idea of intent, there's a bunch of shiurim recommended. Go back and listen to them to really understand this whole concept in depth and why intention is so important in sacrifices. That's the basic law. Now, the question is, what is considered the time of Pesach? The Pesach is really sacrificed in the afternoon. So theoretically, that should really be the time. Ben Beteira says even the morning. Question is, why does Ben Beteira say even the morning? So the first opinion we have is Rabbi Elazar in the name of Rabbi Oshaya. He says in the morning also because he actually thinks that the Korban Pesach can be brought in the morning, which is a very radical thing. We always talk about the Korban Pesach, it's brought in the afternoon. Where do we get this? That Pesach is brought in the morning, even if you want? And we're going to have a whole long discussion about this till eventually, even though we're going to answer a lot of the difficulties, we're going to actually eventually reject it. And then we're going to have Rabbi Yochanan who brings a different interpretation. So right now we're going to start with the questions, the slew of questions. Okay, so we have, right, and then we had yesterday, number one, he has to change the word ki'ilu to explain it because he says it's as if it was sacrificed, right? It said, he said ki'ilu nishchat bein ha'arbaim, as if it was sacrificed in the afternoon. And he's basically saying ki'ilu doesn't really mean ki'ilu. It is sacrificed bein ha'arbaim, which we're going to see how he defines bein ha'arbaim is not afternoon. Usually bein ha'arbaim is afternoon. He's going to say it's actually sacrificed. Why do you use ki'ilu? Because Rabbi Yeshua used ki'ilu. And then we had a second question. Why didn't they argue about the time of the Korban Pesach? If that was really their argument, why they argue about the Shema? And that's because even if they argued about the date, it might not, it could, you might have thought though, that Rabbi Yeshua would agree with him about the Lishma issue, even if he wouldn't agree about the when can you bring the Korban Pesach. So we answered those questions. Now we're going to start with, okay, the very basic question in my Gemara. This starts about 8 lines from the bottom of the daf, from yesterday's daf, Yud Aleph from Bet. V'aktiv bein ha'arbaim, but doesn't it say bein ha'arbaim? How would any of us define bein ha'arbaim? In the afternoon, right? Right, literally means between evenings, but what it really means is close to the evening. Amar Ula b'reid Rabbi Eli bein shnei aravim. He says maybe he understands it literally between two afternoons, right? Two evenings. What would that mean? Between yesterday evening and this evening, which means you could do it from now. You can't do it from night because nobody does sacrifices. The sacrifices aren't brought at night, but that would mean from the morning. It would work. That's his explanation. Okay, but now we're going to go through 3 situations where the Torah says bein ha'arbaim. We're going to see, is this really true? It's not. The Korban Tamid, the daily sacrifice, is brought 1 in the morning and 1 bein ha'arbaim. Bein ha'arbaim is afternoon. The Ktoret, the incense, is offered 1 in the morning, 1 in the afternoon. Bein ha'arbaim. The candles are lit bein ha'arbaim in the evening, right before it gets dark. That's when they would light the menorah in the Beit HaMikdash or in the Mishkan. So we're going to basically raise questions with all of those. And the gist of the answer to each of those is going to be, they actually don't learn it from bein ha'arbaim. The word bein ha'arbaim in all those cases theoretically could mean even from the morning, but there's some other verse from which they learn that it has to be in the evening. That's going to be the gist of this slew of questioning. So the first one, Tamid, Korban Tamid, the daily sacrifice, Dichtiv bein ha'arbaim, hachanami. To Kule Yom HaKasher, what you're going to say the whole day is okay. You can bring it, the one in the afternoon you can bring all day, right? That would be ridiculous. There's one in the morning and there's one in the afternoon. Hatam midachtiv et hakeves echad taseh baboker michlal de bein arbaim mamash. They say, well, there it's clear because it says bring one in the morning and one bein arbaim. The bein arbaim in that context must mean afternoon, but doesn't necessarily always mean afternoon. Ema cha boker v'idach kula yoma. Well, that doesn't necessarily prove it because you could say maybe. Now, this sounds absurd, but that's because we're so used to knowing that the korban tamid was once in the morning, once in the afternoon. But they're suggesting maybe one is brought in the morning, has to be brought in the morning, and the other could be brought all day. Echa baboker v'lo shnayim baboker. No, you can't say that because it says et keves echad taseh baboker. One goes in the morning, which seems to say the other one doesn't go in the morning. So again, that's all derived from some other pasuk. So it doesn't reject Rabbi Oshaya's interpretation. Neirot. Now we're up to the second one, the candles. D'chtiv bein ha'arbaim. Okay, the pasuk is Bahalot Aaron et hanirot bein ha'arbaim yaktirena ktoret tamid lifnei Hashem ledorotechem. Right, when Aaron lights the candles, bein ha'arbaim, it's in the afternoon. Hachinam kulei yom kasher. What, the whole day you could do it? No. Shanei hatam d'chtiv. There's a different pasuk which says me erev ad boker, and we're going to darshan this erev ad boker. It says from evening till morning. Okay, it says this is in both of these are in Shemot, by the way. The first one was in Shemot chapter 30. This is in Shemot 27. Ba'ol moed michutz laparochet asher alaidu ya'aroch oto Aaron ubanav. Aaron will set them up. Right, light, which really means light them. Me erev ad boker. Okay, from evening till morning. How do they darshan this? In two ways. And both really indicate that it's from the evening. Okay, the first one. Vitanya, the Braita says, Me erev ad boker, tein la midata shetedoleket va'olechet me erev ad boker. Put enough oil in it so it will light from the evening to the morning, which makes it clear indication that we're going to light it from the evening and then put in enough that it goes all night. Tavar achil, another interpretation, ein lechavod shera me erev ad boker ela zo bilvad. This is the only thing that you could do from evening till morning, meaning, if you remember, all the other avodot in the temple are done during the daytime. This is the very last one you do before the end of the day, and nothing else can be done after it. That's basically the way they understand this drasha. So, again, indicating this is done in the evening. Okay, so we've gotten that, but that's from a different pasuk. So it doesn't ruin our theory that bein arbaim theoretically could be morning also. Ktoret, the daily incense that they would also do once in the morning, once in the afternoon. Bein arbaim, it's done in the afternoon. Hachanami, t'kuli yom kasher, you're going to say the one of the afternoon you could do also in the morning. This is kind of like the Tamid. Well, shanik ktoret, in this case, we don't have et keves achad taseh baboker and the keves hasheni taseh bein arbaim. It doesn't say that. But shanik ktoret itakash linerot. The pasuk I read before said, "Balot Aaron et hanerot bein arbaim yaktirena ktoret tamid lifnei Hashem ledorotechem." The ktoret is mentioned right next to the candles, so we do a hekesh, a juxtaposition. What was true for that is true for that. Okay, now we've got at the top of your bed. So we resolved all those other issues. Okay, what's the problem though? Well, by Pesach, there's another pasuk that seems to indicate, just like all the others, that it has to be in the afternoon. And then how can Rabbi Oshaya say it can be done in the morning? So just like all those others have an exception where there's a different verse that makes it clear that bein arbaim actually means afternoon. Likewise by Pesach. Hatam namiktiv sham tizbach et Pesach ba'erev. Okay, this is a pasuk in Dvarim Tetzayin. It says, right, you should sacrifice the korban Pesach in the evening. So they say, no, that pasuk is needed for something else. Hahu li'yi'uchal davar hu da'ata. Okay, what is Yu'uchar Davar? It's to tell you that when you have a conflict of two things, particularly the Korban Tamid is in front of you and the Korban Pesach is in front of you, which one do you do later? The Korban Pesach. The word Sham Tizbach et Pesach ba'erev is telling you that's going to be the one that's done later if you have the Korban Tamid in front of you and the Korban Pesach. Now this could be learned from another way, Tadir V'Sheno Tadir Kodem, right? You always do the regular thing first, but they're going to learn it from this pasuk. How do we know? So that's Yu'uchar Davar, that it will be delayed. Okay, the Pesach will be delayed when it's in conflict with the Korban Tamid of the afternoon. Titania. Yu'uchar Davar shene'emar bo ba'erev u'bein arbaim, l'davar shelo ne'emar bo ela bein arbaim bilvad. By the Korban Tamid, it just says bein arbaim. By the Pesach, it says bein arbaim en erev. So we're going to basically choose which one is going to be later, the one that has two words indicating evening. So we're going to say that's the one that comes later. Okay, and therefore that doesn't conflict with our theory. But if it was brought in the morning, you could do it in the morning. Okay, now I say, wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense. Umi kamidi di ilu shachet lemitzafra. If you had slaughtered it in the morning, amar zindehu, you could say that's its proper time. Okay, v'chimati bein arbaim amart uchar davar. But if it's done in the afternoon, and that's if it's done in the morning, it'll be before the korban tamid, obviously, of the afternoon because it was brought in the morning, right? So you can theoretically bring it in the morning, but then if you bring it in the afternoon, it has to be the second thing you bring, right? It's the last thing. That doesn't make so much sense. To which the Gemara says, what do you mean it doesn't make sense? Of course it does. I'll show you a precedent for that. Tahama Rabbi Yochanan, didn't Rabbi Yochanan say, halacha mitpalel shel mincha v'achar kach mitpalel shel musafim. Remember this halacha? If you daven musaf, you could daven in the morning, right? That's usually when we daven musaf, we daven it in the morning. But if you push it off till the afternoon, then you actually have to daven mincha before musaf. And that Rabbi Yochanan says it's based on tadir v'sheino tadir kodem. Okay? So now, right, he paskins that you daven mincha and then you daven musaf, and this is what we do, right? If for some reason you didn't say musaf in the morning and now it's already time for mincha, you actually have to say mincha first. So there you have something that could be done in the morning, but if it's done in the afternoon, it gets pushed off to later, so that's not a question. Okay, but now we're finally going to have two questions that we don't really have an answer for. Ubein arbaim dichtiv be kabek toret v'nira lamali. If you have these other psukim that teach you, right, that we have me'erev ad erev and then the hekesh and all that, and we have all these reasons to understand that bein arbaim could actually be morning, but in this particular case it's afternoon, then why does it even start telling you bein arbaim, which generally means evening, right? If it really means morning, just and I would say skip the words bein arbaim. There was no reason to mention them. It just says, right, me'erev ad boker, right? And that would have been clear that it's done in the evening. And okay, I don't know how strong a question is, but it's a question. But here we have a stronger question. V'od heshiv Rabbi tachat Ben Beteira l'divrei Rabbi Oshaya. Okay, we have in the Tosefta that Rabbi puts words in Ben Beteira's mouth as a response to Rabbi Oshaya. And listen to his words carefully. Lo, I disagree with you. Im amalta b'shloshasal she'em k'tzato ra'ui. If you say why, if you do it on the 13th, right? It's in the morning. You say it's like the 13th because emek tzato ra'ui, because the 13th, none of it is ra'ui for the korban pesach, and therefore it's not bismano. But tomar ba'arba'asal shemek tzato ra'ui. But you can't say the same thing for the 14th because part of the day could be used to sacrifice the korban pesach. Now notice the words he used. He said part of the day, meaning just the afternoon. Vim ita, and if he really believed that all of Yudalit could be time for a sacrifice for the korban pesach, then he should have responded to Rabbi Oshaya, kulo vim ita, if he really believed, like Rabbi Oshaya claims, and others again, this is all Rabbi Oshaya's interpretation of Ben Beteira. According to Rabbi Oshaya's interpretation of Ben Beteira, it's really the korban pesach could be brought all day. If the korban pesach could be brought all day, then he should have said, kulo ra'oihu, the entire day of the 14th is ra'oi for the korban pesach. And that should have been his response to Ben Beteira. And therefore, it seems they reject Rabbi Oshaya's opinion, which again seemed pretty radical to say that Ben Arbaim doesn't really mean Ben Arbaim, and that the Korban Pesach really could be brought in the morning when we all know that it's brought in the afternoon. So this radical position of Rabbi Oshaya thinking that that's what Ben Beteira said is rejected. Ela am Rabbi Yochanan. So here's answer number 2. And this is it for the answers. Posel haya ben Beteira b'Pesach sheshachto b'arba'asar shacharit. Bein lishmo bein shelo lishmo. Ho'il u'miktato ra'ui. Ben Beteira says that the Pesach that you slaughter on the 14th, if you would slaughter the Pesach on the 14th in the morning, whether you slaughter it lishmo, l'shem Pesach, or whether you slaughter it l'shem shlamim, which, by the way, during the year, if you slaughter it l'shem shlamim, you bring it as a shlamim. But on the 14th in the morning, it can't be brought as a shlamim, and it can't be brought as a Pesach. Okay? Ho'il u'miktato ra'ui. Because it's partially, part of that day is ra'oi for the korban pesach. This actually makes a lot of sense, right? It's an entire day that you're spending getting your korban pesach ready, right? Like you're leading up to your dalit in the afternoon. if you were to take that korban in the morning and sacrifice it as a shlamim, right? You already designated as your korban Pesach, right? Your whole day is focused toward the Pesach that you're going to do in the afternoon. We all know it. Without the korban, we're all focused on Pesach, on Erev Pesach, right? Imagine in the time of the Ben Hamikdash when everyone had to bring the korban in the afternoon. If you're going to do it Shalol Lishma that day, for sure you're disqualifying the korban. That day is Pesach day, right? Now, even though you can't sacrifice it then. And what he points out is you actually can't sacrifice it as a Pesach and you can't sacrifice it as anything else. Even though, again, any other time of year you could sacrifice it as something else. And according to Rabbi Oshaya, if you said it was a shlamim, right, that's not zmano. You're not going to disqualify it. Okay? So it would then go as a shlamim. Okay, so he basically says it's because miksa Torah, or he picks up on that language of Rebbe that Rebbe used in the Tosefta, that part of the day is Ra'oi for the Korban Pesach, and therefore we're going to treat the whole day as this is a Pesach day. And because it's a Pesach day, anytime that day you do it l'shem something else, it will be completely disqualified. Migadef Rabbi Elazar. Now we're going to get off on a big tangent. Because what we're talking about now is that the Korban Pesach, there's a time where that designated Korban Pesach is what we call dachui. It's rejected. Can't be used at all. Can't be a Pesach. It can't be a shlamim, right? Can't be anything. So comes Rabbi Elazar and says, Migadif Rabbi Elazar. He says to Rabbi Elazar, how could you say this? In Ken, Pesach kasher Ben Beteira mishkachala. How could you ever have a kosher Korban Pesach? Because Id afreshat idna. If you designated the animal in the morning, dachui meikarahu. It's rejected from the outset. Okay, there's a concept, we're going to talk about this a lot now for the next part of the daf, about dichui. Dichui is, okay, a more classic example is, I have a korban, I designate an animal for a sacrifice, and then what happens? Something happens to disqualify that animal temporarily, like it gets a blemish, let's say. Okay, it gets blemished. Now it can't be used as a korban. Let's say the blemish gets fixed, okay, the animal is healed. I can now no longer use that animal as a korban because there was a point where it was rejected from being used as a korban. So likewise here, he says, if I designate it in the morning, where the morning is not a time I can bring not a korban pesach with it and not a shlamim with it. So it's dachui mi'ikara. It's rejected from its outset. What's the outset? The outset is the moment that I designate it for the sacrifice. So the moment I designate it, it's already disqualified. So even though later in the afternoon it will be qualified, it's already been rejected. If this is a concept about bringing things on the altar, that you only want to bring perfect things. So if something was brought and was rejected because it couldn't be brought on the altar for a particular time frame, we can no longer bring it because it's like rejected. We're going to bring something to God that was rejected. So that's what he says. Number one, if I designated it in the morning, from the outset, from when I designated it, it already couldn't be brought as a sacrifice. So of course I can't bring that in the afternoon. If I did it from yesterday or from a month ago or whatever it might be, now at that point it was valid as a sacrifice. Why? Because it could have been brought as a shlamim. Okay, because a Pesach not bismano can be brought as a shlamim. But it's nira. Nira means not seen, but ra'oi. It could have been, it was potentially able to be brought. But it was nidche after. Now there's two types of dichui. One is I designated him from the outset. It was never good to be used. The other is it was good to be used at some point, but then became rejected. That would be if I designated it from before Pesach, before the Yudalit, okay, any day before, and then we get to Yudalit in the morning, according to the way Rabbi Yochanan explains Ben Beteira, that morning can't do anything with it. Right? According to Rabbi Oshaya, it's very easy. You can bring it as a shlamim. But according, right, because it's not the time for Pesach yet. But if it's the time for Pesach, but can be used for Pesach, and it can't be used for a shlamim, it's rejected. So how could you possibly have a case? So now Rabbi Elazar is going to answer his own question, and Rav Papa and Abai are also going to bring answers to this question. Three possible ways you could designate this animal without it being rejected. Ela am Rabbi Elazar, teila achar chatzot. Obvious answer is only designate your animal after chatzot. Okay, so everyone would have to designate their animal after midday of the 14th. And then there's no issue of rejection. Abai Hamal, afilu tema mitzafred. You could say from the morning. Ein mechusar zman lebo bayom. Okay, mechusar zman means it's missing, right? It's missing something, like it can't be yet used, which would then be rejection here. But if it's that same day, we don't view that as being rejected. If it can't be brought now, but it can be brought later that day, we don't view that as a rejection. So theoretically, you could designate it in the morning. Rav Papa Amar, Filu Temami Orti, says even from the night before. Because Laila Emechusar Zman, because even the night, the night, what's the issue with the night? You can't bring a sacrifice at night at all. So if I designate it at night, you would say, oh, that's dachui because it can't be brought. Now then you would have a problem with any sacrifice because if you designate it the day before, the night comes and makes it a time when you can't bring a sacrifice. So basically, it makes a lot of sense to say we don't view the night as mechusar zman as an issue here, okay? It can't be brought in the night. No, because the night goes with the day, and if it can be brought during the day, we view the night as if it's part of the day, okay? The day after, and we're going to see a proof from this from a totally different context. Ditani debei Rabbi Yishmael. We're going to have a converging of two halachot here. One is an animal can't be used as a sacrifice until it's 8 days old. Okay, the first 7 days of its life stays with its mother, right? It can't be used as a sacrifice. After that, you can sacrifice it. So a sacrifice is only from an animal that's 8 days old. Another halacha is the maaser behema, the 10th animal. Okay, this is appropriate for Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur and Netana Tokef. We say ma'avir tzono tachat shivto, right? That God passes us like sheep under his staff. That's the way you would do the maaser behema. They would have the animals go one by one out of the deer, out of their pen. You would walk them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. The guy with his staff would, the owner kind of counts them with the staff. And then when you get to the 10th is sanctified. So now the question is, when do you put the animal, at what age, what day does the animal from when they're born go into the deer, into the pen to be counted out for the maaser behema? Only when they could be brought as a sacrifice, because the 10th animal is going to be sacrificed. So, Tane debei Rabbi Yishmael, Leil Shmini, Nichnas Ladir Lihitaser, already the night of the 8th. Okay, even though the animal can only be brought as sacrifice on the day of the 8th, okay, because there are no sacrifices at night. But even at night, if you're going to count your animals at night, which is interesting to think that they would do that. It was dark out. I don't know why they would do it at night, but theoretically, you could do it at night. Uchid Rabbi Aptoliki, and as Rabbi Aptoliki says, interesting name, probably from the Greek, to Rabbi Aptoliki Rami, he raises a contradiction. K'tiv v'ayashivat yamim tachad imo. It says it should be 7 days under its mother, meaning can't be brought as a sacrifice yet. Halayla chaze. From there, it sounds like the nighttime could be a potential time to, yes, bring as a sacrifice. Uktiv miyom hashmini v'hala yeratzeh. But then it says, from the 8th day, can it be used for ritzui, right, as a sacrifice? Halayla lo chaz. It sounds like the nighttime is not a potential time. HaKetzad, how does this work? Laila l'kedusha v'yom la'artzah. At night, you can already designate it, consecrate it. And in the morning, though, the ritzui can only be done, right, using it as a sacrifice during the day because there were no sacrifices at night. Anyway, this all proves that night is potential. You could actually, right, the night before is fine. So Rav Papu said you could designate the night before and not worry that, oh, it's not right way for a korban yet because it goes with the day, and the day already, again, we said the morning goes with the afternoon, right, because that day potentially could be used. So they think that's okay, even though Rabbi Abau said it would have to be done only in the afternoon because of this issue of rejection. Now, Rabbi Abau clearly thinks this issue of rejection is clearly, he says, when he reads Rabbi Yochanan, he says, but wait, there's this issue of the animal being rejected, right? That's clear. And then he has to explain it. So it means that he thinks that Rabbi Yochanan holds that animals are rejected. Okay, that seems pretty clear. So Amar le Rabbi Zera le Rabbi Avau. So Rabbi Zera comes to Rabbi Avau and says, Lema kasava Rabbi Yochanan ba'alei chayim nidchim? Are you trying to say, right? Are you saying that Rabbi Yochanan holds that animals are rejected? Now, we know that animals are rejected. What's he asking? Ba'alei chayim means live animals. Now, there's a big debate about dichui. When we talk about korbanot getting rejected, there's a big debate about whether this is only once they're slaughtered and they're no longer alive that they could be rejected, or even at the stage when they're still alive. Okay, is it from the time of hafrasha when we designate it, which seems to be what the sugya is saying? It's clear. I mean, that's what the sugya is talking about. But in other places, there's a big machloket about this. Perhaps it can only become rejected once it's slaughtered from the time of shchita and not from the time of so early on of designating the animal. So he's basically saying, are you saying that Rabbi Yochanan's position on this machloket is that it does apply dichoy, this rejection, this idea of rejecting, being rejected from the mizbeach is then permanent? Are you saying that applies when the animals are still alive, according to Rabbi Yochanan? Because that's obviously what Rabbi Avahu said. To which Rabbi Avahu said, yeah, Amar Le'in. He said, yes, I do think that Rabbi Yochanan holds this way. And I'm going to further prove it from something Rabbi Yochanan said. Now we're going to go into a different sugya where you're going to see this. Da Amar Rabbi Yochanan, behema shel shnei shutafim. You have an animal that is owned by two owners. Hikdish chetzia. So let's say you and me own the animal, and I take my half and I say I'm sanctifying this to the temple. Now, at that moment, I cannot bring it as a sacrifice because I don't own the whole animal. You own half the animal. So it's not ra'oi la'alot al mizbeach, right? It can't be brought on the altar. So a few things. Number one, at that moment, it's rejected, okay? Even though it's still alive because we both own the animal and it's a live animal. So number one, it's rejected to go on the altar. Number two, it's sanctified. There's two ways you could sanctify an animal. One is the animal is supposed to go on the altar. In this case, the animal is not going to go on the altar itself because I'm only, what does it mean when I sanctify half the animal? I can't bring it on the altar because I can't cut the animal in half and then bring it to the altar. So the only thing I could do really, since you own the other half and I have no rights to that, is bring the value of half the animal, go buy, right, take it, sell it, right, or just redeem that value onto money, go buy an animal with that money and bring it on the altar, right? Buy a smaller animal or something, bring it on the altar. So that's what we call kedushat damim. That's going to come up later. That's why I'm saying it. Not kedushat aguf, not that the body of the animal is sanctified or half the body is sanctified, but its value is. Okay. Anyway, so it's owned by two animals. Now, if I consecrate half of it, then I go v'chazar v'lakach chetzia v'kdisha. Then I buy the other half off of you. I buy you out of the animal. I now own the entire animal, and now I designate. Then I consecrate the entire animal. Now, you think I can now bring it on the altar, but I can't. Why not? Well, kedosha ve'ena kreva. It's sanctified because I've sanctified it, so its value is sanctified. But I can't bring it on the altar. I have to wait till it gets a blemish, and then I can sell it, take the money, and go buy a different animal with it. Okay? I can't bring it on the altar because it was originally rejected. What do you see from here? You see from here that dachoy is a problem in a live animal. And that's Rabbi Yochanan who said this. A few other halachot. Oseh tmura. Now, tmura cannot be done by joint owners. But once I buy the whole animal, if I did a tmura, now I can't do tmura anyway, but tmura is ineffective. Remember tmura. Tmura is I substitute a different animal in its place. I'm never allowed to do that. I can't say, oh, instead of this one, I'm doing this one. What I would have to do, as we said, I'd have to wait till that has a blemish, sell it, take the money, and buy another animal. But if the animal is ra'oi to go on the altar, it can go on the altar. I can't just say, oh, I'm taking a different animal in its place. But if I do, both animals are sanctified. So in this case, the tamura would be effective. Both animals would be sanctified. If we jointly owned it, it wouldn't be. But that's because I bought you out. So once I buy you out, it's a single owner, and it would be tamura. And tamura take yotzeba. Now both are sanctified. Theoretically, both have to be offered on the altar. But what's the issue? The first one can't be because of the whole dachoy issue. And the second one only comes from the power of the first. So the second one can't do anything that the first can't do. So if the first can't be sacrificed, the second can't be sacrificed. So both are sanctified. Both, you need to wait till they get a blemish, sell them, take the money, and buy new sacrifices with. Okay, now, Shema minatzlat. They love to say this. You can infer three halachot from here. They love the number three. Three halachot. Shema mina, number one, baalei chayim nitchim. That's what we were looking for. According to Rabbi Yochanan, this animal was rejected, right? Because I didn't own the whole thing and I couldn't have sacrificed it at that moment. Because I couldn't sacrifice it at that moment, it's rejected and it can no longer ever be sacrificed. Number two, Shema mina, dachoy meikara, hava dachoy. Now you might have thought, let's think about what's worse. To have something that was never able to go on the altar and then later becomes able to, or something that was potential could go on the altar, then got rejected, and then got potential to go on the altar again. It's worse to be rejected after you could have been accepted. So you might have thought it's only near Evanitche, only something that originally could have gone on the altar and then got rejected from going on the altar. But maybe something that was rejected from its outset. Now, what's the outset? Not when it's born, but the outset is when the moment of designation. This, from the moment of designation, already couldn't be used. That's called dachui mi'ikara. That's also dachui. In other words, don't think it's only something that could have been brought and then got rejected. No, something that is also rejected from its outset is called rejected. And number three, Shema Mina, turning Tamud Bet, Yesh Dichui B'Damim. You might have thought, these are all you might have thoughts, okay? And they were saying, but not. You might have thought that maybe only an animal that can go on the altar could be rejected, right? But maybe something that just its value is sanctified, like this animal, because I didn't own the whole animal. So I couldn't have brought the animal from the outset. So the animal was only sanctified by its value, not its goof, not its body. And even then, dichoy comes into play. So what do you see here? There's dichoy, there's rejection, even for something that wasn't ever going to go on the altar, but just its value was given to the altar. That could be rejected as well. That's a big chiddush. So anyway, those are three things we learned about dachoy from here. The whole point being that Rabbi Yavau, after Rabbi Zera asked him, are you trying to say that Rabbi Yochanan sides on that side of the machloket, that even when it's alive, it could be dachoy? And he says, yes. And I'm going to further prove it for this case of the Shnei Shutafim. Okay, Amar Ula. Now we're going to have two halachot that we're going to pass down also in the name of Rabbi Yochanan about dichoy. So we're off on a tangent about this whole rejection thing. Amar Ula, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Achal chelev, v'frish korban. I ate chelev, and then I designate a korban to bring. Right, I ate chelev by accident. I'm now supposed to bring a sin offering. I bring an animal. I say, this is going to be for my sin offering. Vehemir dat. But before I actually sacrifice the animal, I decide not to be Jewish anymore. And I leave the religion. Now, at that point, what happens? Remember, we learned this, that a meshumad or a mumar, however you call it, we learned this in Horayot, is not allowed to bring a korban. Okay? So, remember, it's hashav miyidiato, someone who recognizes their error, their sin of their error of their ways, very appropriate for Yom Kippur coming up, right? You have to have recognition. If you did something wrong, this person decided to leave religion, they don't care. So at that point, the animal's rejected and can't be brought on the altar. But what if I then change my mind? V'chazar bo. Okay, Yom Kippur comes and I decide, you know what, maybe I'll go back to being Jewish. So I change my mind. Now I want to take this animal and bring it from a chelev. Well, I can't. Once it was rejected from when I left the religion, then it's rejected for good. It Marnami, it was also said, Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah, Amar Rabbi Avau, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Again, we have Rabbi Avau here. He says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Achal chelev v'frish korban v'nishtata v'chazar v'nishtafa. Here we have a person who loses their sanity. So, right, they're not of same mind. They're a shoteh, which again is always a hard term to exactly define what that means. But we have chelev, then I designate a korban, and then something happens to me and I'm mentally unstable. And right, I don't have da'at anymore. I don't have knowledge, a capability of making decisions. So then I'm no longer obligated to bring a sacrifice. So again, rejection. But then chazar v'nishtafa, I was healed, and I'm back to being regular. Ho'il v'nidcha yidacheh. Again, once it was rejected, it's completely rejected. Now we have the obvious question: why did Rabbi Yochanan have to say this about case number one and case number two? Utzriche. Why do you need them both? Now we're going to talk about unique reasons for each, okay, and theoretical, and a theoretical plane, what's the difference between the two? If we had the first one about leaving the religion, well, that person did it on their own. Right? It was their own doing that caused them to leave the religion. It wasn't some other, right? They decided to leave the religion. But in the case of the shoteh, they didn't decide to be a shoteh. It just happened to them. Maybe it's just like the person was sleeping, right? Every night you go to sleep, if you designated sacrifice as animals before and you haven't yet brought them on, to be sacrificed, what we're going to say, nighttime messes it up because while you're sleeping, you're not thinking, right? You don't have da'at right now. You're not really conscious. And, right, it's like so the shoteh is like they're sleeping. It was beyond their control, basically. But that's why you need them both, because even in that case, and if you had just the shoteh case, you would say that that person has no ability to control coming back. That might be more of a rejection because they can't get back to a situation. They can't on their own. They can't bring about their healing process. Okay, there's no way they could fix that, and it's not in their control. Aval hachad yesh biyado lachzor, but maybe the person who left the religion, since it's in their control to actually come back, emalo. Maybe it's not full rejection because you know you can always come back whenever you want. So maybe it's not completely rejected. Tzricha. That's why you need them both because it's really rejected completely in both cases. And you can never bring that animal again as a sacrifice. Obviously, you come back, you take a new animal. It's just that animal is rejected. Now we have a question by Rabbi Yirmiyah. Okay, I want you to notice this is all happening in Israel, right? There's Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Oshaya in the beginning of Ben Beteira was also in Israel. Ula is one of the people who brings the Torah of Israel to Babylonia. We have Rabbi Yirmiyah, Rabbi Avau. They're all Chachmei Eretz Israel discussing these opinions of the rabbis of Eretz Israel. By Rabbi Yirmiyah. Rabbi Yirmiyah asked another question. Now, classic Rabbi Yirmiyah question. Remember Rabbi Yirmiyah, he always has those, either you call them nudniki questions or you say, wait, he really was just trying to get to the real idea behind it. Achal chelev v'ifrish korban. This is going to bring us back to Horayot. So I ate chelev, then I did it right by accident. I set aside an animal. Now what happens? Holu beitin. Now the beitin comes and teaches shechelev mutal. But by the way, this chelev is permitted. And then I'm no longer obligated by the korban. So the korban again gets rejected. V'chazru bahen. But then the beitin changes their mind. They say, oh, you know what? We were wrong. This chelev is forbidden. And now I'm obligated in the sacrifice again. Mahu. What do we say here? Mi havidichui or la havidachui? Was this rejected or not rejected? Okay, it's not exactly clear because it's a little bit different, right? Here, it wasn't me, wasn't right, anything of my doing. Well, we got a very interesting answer to Rabbi Yirmiyah's question. Okay, so he wants to know, do the laws of dichoy apply in this case? Okay, because it was all just a mistaken ruling of the beitin, which then got undone. Maybe it's not really rejection. Amar lehu Saba, an elderly man came over, an elderly, usually the elders are very knowledgeable, or they just heard the shiur, many years ago and remember. He says, ki patach Rabbi Yochanan b'duchuyin mehai patach. The first shiur of the year that Rabbi Yochanan would do about dachoy was this case. This is the classic case of dachoy. So yes, it is dachoy. It's rejected. Now, why is this the classic case? My taima. Hatam gavra idche. Korban lo idche. Hacha korban nami idche. And all the other examples we brought, it was the person who was dachoy. The person left the religion. The person became a shote, right? It wasn't the animal, actually. It was the person couldn't bring the animal, and therefore the animal gets rejected. But this is so much more dachoy because the animal gets rejected. Why does the animal get rejected? You wouldn't have necessarily thought to see it this way. But right, usually you think the animal getting rejected was like it had a blemish, like the other example I gave. But here the animal got rejected because as soon as the beitin ruled the chelev is permitted, it doesn't have to do with the person really. It has to do with the animal. The animal is no longer valid for a korban because no one's going to ever bring this korban anymore. There's no korban chatat at that point for eating chelev. So, or eating this kind of chelev. So that animal got completely rejected from the sacrifice. It didn't have to do with the person at all. And then it comes back. So that's actually a more classic case of dachoy. And yes, so the answer is yes to your question, Rabbi Yirmiyah, that is dachoy. Okay. End of section with dachoy. Now we're going to move to Rabbi Shimon ben Azar. If you remember, the second part of our Mishnah was a different topic completely, which was, right, the first was, when is it zmano, not zmano, right? How do we treat your dalet in the morning? Machloket Ben Beteira. Rabbi Yoshua, maybe I'll do the summary of the first part of the daf right now, because we're really switching topics. From there, we had two interpretations. The first, Rabbi Elazar in the name of Rabbi Oshaya. The second, Rabbi Yochanan. What is the machloket Ben Beteira and the rabbi and Rabbi Yoshua? Is Ben Beteira saying that the whole day of Pesach you can actually bring a korban? And we thought that. We asked a lot of questions. We answered most of them, but then ended up with questions we really couldn't answer. Came Rabbi Yochanan and said, no, he doesn't think that. He doesn't think you can bring it in the morning. He just thinks that since you can bring it in the afternoon, you can also bring it in the morning. From there, Rabbi Avau got off on this whole thing about dachui, right? Because basically he says that first he asked this question. He says, sounds like, according to Rabbi Yochanan, right, how would Ben Beteira ever be able to bring a korban? Because in that morning of the 14th, it's rejected and you can't bring it as anything. So if you would designate the korban before or even on the morning of the 14th, you would have no way to bring that korban because it would be dachli. It would be completely rejected. That animal can't be brought. It can't be brought as any sacrifice, and therefore would be rejected. It can't be a Pesach, can't be a shlam. to which we gave several options, either do it for the afternoon, or maybe that morning is considered, or maybe even the night before it's considered a problem. Then Rabbi Abbas was asked by Rabbi Zeira, are you trying to say that Rabbi Yochanan thinks there's dichoy with animal or dachoy with animals that are alive and not only after and not there's this machloket, is it only after they're slaughtered that they could get rejected? And he says, yes, I do believe that. He brings the Shnei Shutafim case to prove it. Then we have some other halachot that Rabbi Yochanan said about animals being rejected. Okay, and then we have Rabbi Yirmiyah's question, what about if they taught by mistake and then it got rejected? And then we said, oh, that's the classic example Rabbi Yochanan used to bring. And that's our review. Now we're going to move to the second part. Shema ben Azai said, I have a tradition from 72 Zkanim that what? That Ola is another example of sacrifice that can be brought. If it's brought lo lishma, it's rejected, like the Pesach, like the Chatan. To which we are going to do two things. The first is, Lamali lemitna shivim ushnayim zaken. If you remember, he says, I have a tradition of 72 rabbis, judges, and or elders, and the rabbis didn't agree with him, though. Okay, despite the fact that he said that, they didn't agree with him. We're now going to see something even more so. Why do you have to say 72 zaken and not skinim? It should be plural. Well, the reason is dekulu b'chad shitat avukaimin. All of them agreed unanimously. It wasn't just, we heard it from the majority of the 72, but all 72 agreed unanimously that the Ola is also an example of lo lishma that's rejected. It's completely disqualified, and still the rabbis didn't agree with him. Okay, now we want to figure out, where does he get this from? Well, for this, we're going to have two possibilities today. And we're going to have it. I want you to remember that it's all Rav Huna, because later the Gemara is going to go back to Rav Huna in tomorrow's daf, and you're going to say, "What Rav Huna? Where did Rav Huna come up?" So I'm telling you now, pay attention. So lo hosif ben azai ela ha'ola. Okay, what he really was saying, because if you remember, he said all the Zevachim hane'chalim, all the ones that can be eaten, if you bring them shalol lishma, they're not disqualified, other than the Chatan and the Pesach. But he was only talking about Zevachim hane'chalim, the ones that were eaten, and the Ola's it doesn't get eaten, the whole thing gets burnt. So the Ola was outside of the group of, they're all brought shalol lishma, they're all accepted, except for those two. So the Ola must be an exception to the rule as well. I'm a Rav Huna, my Tamid ben Azai. So right now we're going to go through two possible trains of thinking. Okay, one's a drasha and one's a kal vachomer. So the first is a drasha. Rav Huna says, what's the reason for ben Azai? Ola hu isherech nichoch laHashem. Here we go back to, again, the who, just like chatat hu meant chatat has to be brought exactly the way it's supposed to be brought. Ola also, it has to be brought exactly the way it's supposed to be brought. Hi lishma kshera, shelo lishma psula. So if it's lishma, it's good. If it's not lishma, disqualified. But Hashem nami ktib behu. We go back to what we keep going back to, but Hashem also says who. And we don't say that, right? Again, Rabbi Elazar does, but no one else does. So they say no, because the who, remember, by the Asham, remember that's written in the part where it talks about parts that don't actually have to be done. The burning of the parts on the altar are not essential to the korban. Therefore, okay, so it says who there, but that's not the important part. We need it to be said who by the major avodot. Shlitas, Kabbalah, Holacha, Zrika. So they say, Hainami also by Ola, by the way. It's mentioned at the end part, when they're putting the parts on the altar, which is the end part. So it's also not said in the important part. But Trehu Ktive, it says who twice in Ola. So we're going to assume the first time, now both are in the Haktarani Murim part, when you're burning the parts on the altar. So it's there, it's not Haktarani Murim, it's the Haktara of everything, because the Ola gets completely burned. Murim are just the parts of like a Shlamim and a Chatan and Asham, that just parts of it get burnt on the altar. But anyway, the point being that it says it twice. So one time it's in its context. The other time it doesn't need to be there. So Ime no inyan, remember we've learned this many times, if it's not teaching you that, well, it must be coming to teach you something else. So it must be coming to teach you even at the earlier stages. And then we have Olahu, and we got it. But then they say that doesn't work, because Gabe Asham Nami Trehu Ktive. Do the exact same thing with Asham. There happen to be two psukim that say who by Asham. So that doesn't work. Okay, let's try another way. Ela ben Azai b'kavachomer ma'itela. He learns it by kavachomer. Here's the kavachomer. Very obvious. Ola is always the most severe because it all gets burnt. A sin offering which doesn't all get burnt, and yet if it's done lo lishma, it's disqualified. Ola she kalil lo koshken, and Ola which all gets burnt, all the more so. But not so easy, because malachatat there's chumrah, a stringency by chatat that it atones. Okay, but Pesach yochiach. Pesach will prove that's not so important because Pesach doesn't have atonement and yet it's also completely disqualified. So if you take the two together, you actually could get to the Chatat. B'mala Pesach shkin tzvano kavua. I know it has its own chumrah. So the Chatat has a stringency that it atones. Pesach has a stringency that it has only one particular time that you can do it, right? One afternoon a year. Whereas the Olam Chatat could bring any day of the year. Chatat tuchiach v'chazar adin lo rizeh kirizeh v'lo rizeh kirizeh. Again, all those stringencies of Chatat and Pesach neutralize each other because this one doesn't have that chumrah, that one doesn't have that chumrah. So chazar adin lo rizeh kirizeh v'lo rizeh kirizeh tzara shavesh ben. Right, we knock out each one. What's the least common denominator? Shem kodashim, they're sanctified. Shchatan shalol lishma pasul. And if you slaughter them shalol lishma, they'll be right, they're disqualified. Afani aviola shikochim shchatal shalol lishma pasula. So I'll bring the ola, right? From the two, you could get to the ola, which has the same criteria. So that sounds like a good kal vachomer, but what's the problem? Malat tzad hashavesh ben sheyesh b'hem tzad karet. But wait, both the Pesach and Chatat have some association with karet, different. Pesach, if you don't bring it, you get karet. And chatat is on a sin that if you had done it intentionally, it would be karet. Not exactly the same, but they both are associated with karet. That's a chomer by both. That's not by the ola. So you can't learn a kal vachomer, to which the answer, Ben Azai tzad karet lo parach. Ben Azai doesn't have that issue. Why not? Because he says those two karets are quite different from each other, and they're not the same thing. You can't say, oh, they both have karet associated with it. One is karet, right? One is because of a punishment that's associated with, right, a sin that's associated with karet. One is you'll get karet if you don't do this. Those are two completely different karets, right? And the same karet, but they have totally different reasons. He didn't have that issue, and that's how you could possibly explain it. But we're going to have further questions on this, and we'll get to that in the daf for tomorrow, which will go up soon after class today. With that, we finished. So what we did here, Shimon ben Azai, number one, why it said zaken, and number two, what's his reason? Rav Huna first brought a proof from a pasuk, and then Rav Huna brought a kal vachomer, and we're in the middle of that kal vachomer right now, trying to figure out, is it viable kal vachomer or not? With that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a Shabbat Shalom and Gmar Chatima Tova and Shishma B'sorot Tovot.